No more mask, no more vaccine verifications to enter public places like restaurants, bars, and gyms, and even free COVID testing sites are quickly disappearing. Yes, this is what's happening all across America. Governors and other politicians have declared that it's time to just live with the COVID-19 virus. What does all of this mean? And should elected officials be the ones determining that the pandemic is now endemic? What do the scientists have to say about this new phase of COVID? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
This morning, the White House issued a 96-page plan aimed at ushering the United States into what some are calling a new normal for the pandemic. The plan has four main parts: protect against and treating COVID-19, prepare for new variants, avoid shutdowns, and fight the pandemic. Now, what does this elaborate plan mean for everyday life? And will this plan eliminate the disruption to our daily lives that has persisted for almost 2 years? And a lot of people are asking, is it really time to get back to normal, or is it way too soon? I have experts here to weigh in. Here for our leadoff discussion is Dr. Amesha Adalja. He is a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and he's a returning guest to the Special Report. Good morning, and good to see you again, Dr. Adalja.
Thank you for having me.
Wow, you've been with us on this journey where we've been trying to understand and help educate people about the virus, about the vaccines, and about how to keep ourselves and our families safe. So here we are at what appears to be this really new phase of the virus. But yet I'm concerned because it looks like the politicians have been doing more talking than the scientists. So I need to get from you your scientific view about what's happening around masks and vaccinations.
What we have in the United States is a new situation, a situation that's really characterized by a high level of immunity in the population, immunity from vaccines, immunity from booster shots, immunity from people getting infected. And that makes it increasingly unlikely that we're going to see surges of cases turn into hospitals in crisis. And you have to remember, from the very beginning of the pandemic, we've always been keenly focused on making sure hospitals were able to perform all their duties. And we had that graph, that bell curve with that line through it. That line meant hospital capacity. We were flattening the curve to preserve hospital capacity. And that's what all of our tools have done. They've basically made COVID-19 into a tamer virus for those who are vaccinated, those who have access to antivirals, those who have monoclonal antibodies that they can receive, rapid tests. All of that makes COVID more like other respiratory viruses. And that's why there's this flexibility with mask policy, with contact tracing policy, with all of it, because we are getting to a place where this is going to be just like any other infectious disease we deal with. And we've got to come up with a sustainable approach that fits that new reality we have with this virus.
But you can see, Dr. Adalja, why there is some confusion, because it looks like in states like California and New York, it was the governors of those states who got out front and started talking about eliminating the mask mandate, eliminating the requirement for vaccine proof when you enter public places. We didn't see the scientists, the CDC, or Dr. Fauci, or the people that we have been looking to throughout this pandemic jump out and make these pronouncements, essentially saying the pandemic is over, although, that's not what they said verbatim, but I think that's the message that's being conveyed. So you can see how that causes people to be a little concerned that, is this, for electoral politics' sake, or is this really science?
The CDC has sort of always lagged whatever trend was going on. It takes some time for the CDC to update guidance. They aren't leading, they're actually following what's already happening. But in this case, I do think the science supports the updating of the guidance, and the science supported governors in New Jersey and New York following other governors, like my own governor in Pennsylvania, for example, that were relaxing restrictions based on what they saw. It just takes some time to catch up. And definitely there's a lot of politics involved in here. It's not surprising that the president announced a lot of this during his State of the Union Union address. Maybe there was some delay in waiting for the State of the Union to be able to kind of announce it publicly in that way. But clearly politics are wrapped up in it. But in this case, there's been a change in the caliber of our infections. They are being driven more to the outpatient side because we've got so much protection, so many tools we didn't have early in the pandemic.
What about the people who still haven't gotten vaccinated, but who got COVID and believe that because they have COVID, they have this immunity? We've also seen reports that that immunity is not forever immunity, that some of that immunity starts to wane after 3 months, after 6 months. Is there any concern about those people, that those of us who are vaccinated are going to be mixing in restaurants and bars with those unvaccinated people who believe they have immunity because they had COVID?
So if you're somebody that's fully vaccinated, if you're up to date, especially if you're one of those high risk categories, you really have nothing to fear from COVID-19, because when you get COVID-19, it's going to be a mild illness, one that probably doesn't even prompt you to call your doctor. And I think that's always been the goal of COVID-19, to make it more mild. And that's what vaccination does for people. For the unvaccinated, if you've got some level of immunity from prior infection, that's going to protect you against severe disease. And in the past, we've seen, yes, reinfections can occur, especially with certain variants, but those people tend to be protected from serious disease. But I do encourage those people to get at least one dose of vaccine, because that will give them this idea of this concept of hybrid immunity, where they basically become the most immune people on the planet. But I think we're coming to a point now that we understand that the vaccines are extremely good at protecting us from serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And if you're vaccinated, I think you should feel free to go back to your normal life, because you're protected against what matters. And this all depends on your own risk tolerance. And I think we will get to a point where COVID-19 is thought of like influenza, because our immunity has become so much stronger with vaccines, because we've got tools like antivirals and monoclonals.
Well, you said those people that have had COVID and then get at least one vaccine are like the most protected people on the planet. But what about what we've heard about the waning of immunity for people who have COVID? Or should we not care about that now? The fact that that immunity only lasts for a certain amount of months?
When it comes to coronaviruses, they often can reinfect us. There are 4 other coronaviruses that cause about 30% of our common colds, and they reinfect all of us after about a year or so. This is what COVID is doing in those people now. That's what Omicron represents. And Omicron can do that even to a vaccinated or a boosted person. It can get around immunity. But what we really have to focus on is not the waning immunity to a mild infection. It's waning immunity to severe infections. And that's something much harder for the virus to be able to do. So even in people who've had prior infection, yes, they may be able to get reinfected after 6 months, 8 months, a year, but it's less likely that they have severe disease. It can occur, but it's less likely to occur. That's why I encourage people to top off that natural immunity with at least one dose of a vaccine. But I think for the vaccinated, they don't pose a risk to you as much as people who are completely unvaccinated, no immunity. Those are the people that we really worry about, because those are the ones who may end up taking up an ICU bed. But increasingly, there's fewer and fewer of those people, and those people have other options now, like Paxlovid, the Pfizer antiviral, or monoclonal antibodies. So we're not seeing the ability of this virus to crush hospitals the way it once could, because of the population's changes in terms of immunity, as well as all the tools we have.
So it wasn't so long ago, Dr. Adalja, where people were talking about, if I'm vaccinated, I'm only going to parties, I'm only going to functions with other vaccinated people. And families were having big spats. Like, you can't come to Christmas, you can't come to Thanksgiving because you're not vaccinated. Should we just drop all of those rules and embrace everyone despite their vaccination status?
Not completely, but I do think that Omicron changed the equation, because Omicron was an immune evasive variant, a variant that could get around some of the protection that vaccines provided. So we weren't really seeing the vaccines prevent infection. In the early days with Delta and Alpha and the original version of the virus, clearly vaccinated people were less likely to be carrying the virus, less likely to spread it. Some of that has changed with Omicron. It still is the case that vaccinated people are less likely to be infected and spread it, but it's become less of an issue with Omicron because there's so many breakthrough infections that occur. But I do think that if you've got high risk people at a party, for example, you may still want to restrict that to vaccinated individuals, because yes, everybody can get Omicron, but a vaccinated person is less likely to get it, less likely to be contagious for so long. But we are probably going to see somewhat of a normalization now, at least with what we're seeing with the vaccinated and unvaccinated, because we're not so much worried about cases spiraling out of control and crushing hospitals anymore. So some of the temperature is going to dial down as we move into this endemic phase.
So what about masks? Lots of news about masks. We saw at the State of the Union last night, the president didn't wear a mask, and he's been, seen pretty much all the time wearing a mask. The vice president didn't have on one, the speaker of the House, most of the members of Congress did not. They were all in a confined, enclosed space. What is your recommendation about mask wearing at this point?
I think that mask wearing is something that each individual needs to decide for themselves based on their individual risk tolerance, based on what risk factors for severe disease they have. And we have to respect other people's decisions about masks. I think that if you're someone that's fully vaccinated, the mask is probably going to provide you marginal benefit because yes, you might stop yourself from getting a COVID-19 infection, but if it's a mild infection that's similar to the cold in a vaccinated individual, it probably doesn't serve that same purpose. And as we see cases fall, the likelihood you run into COVID-19 is becoming smaller. And we've got tools like antivirals that we didn't have earlier on. We've got rapid tests that are more widely available. So all of that kind of gives masks kind of a secondary importance in my mind. But again, it's up to each individual's risk tolerance. And remember, the way masking works for those people who still want to continue to wear a mask. And there's a lot of access now to good fitting, high quality masks that there weren't in the early days of the pandemic.
So I know you said the CDC is often behind, it lags in terms of its pronouncements, but do you expect there to be a change with respect to air travel and train travel where we won't have to wear masks when we take an air flight?
That's unclear to me. That's not something that the CDC itself regulates. I think this goes through the Department of Transportation and the TSA. That rule is in effect at least for half of this month. We'll see if they renew it. Again, this is going to be something that's controversial. I'm not sure exactly which way they'll go on it, but it's clear that we're getting to a point where COVID-19 is going to be managed like influenza, like other respiratory viruses. And in that sense, that likely leaves less room for masks to be mandates and maybe masks to be optional. And of course, airlines can set their own policy for what they require on their flights.
What about you? Would you feel safe getting on a crowded plane without mask and sitting next to people who are unmasked?
I think I would in general, because I know that I'm vaccinated, that I'm not going to get severe infection. I know that COVID-19 is something all of us are going to experience at some time or another. You may want to wear a mask just so it doesn't spoil your vacation if you get sick there and you have COVID-19. But remember that COVID-19 is a virus that can't be eradicated. It can't be eliminated. We're all going to have some experience with COVID-19 at some point in our life. And I think that it's not something you can completely avoid, but I would be okay without wearing a mask, but that's my risk tolerance, and that may be different from other people's risk tolerance.
So you mentioned, politics playing a part in what we're seeing, and obviously the president last night in his State of the Union talked about COVID and this new phase. He also talked about this new program that's being rolled out where you'll be able to go to your local drugstore, take a COVID test, and if you test positive on the spot, be able to get this new Pfizer pill. How is that going to be a game changer, and what does that pill do?
So that pill is called Paxlovid, and it interferes with the way the virus processes its proteins. And it's a very effective drug, 90% effective at preventing hospitalization. But you've got this 5-day window to get it for when it's maximally effective. So that means someone has to get tested and has to scramble to get that pill. So the easier we can make it for people to get that pill quickly, the better we're going to see the impact of it. Because if you have these pills and people are getting them too late or don't know how to get them, they're not going to be of any use if they're sitting on the shelf at the drugstore. So I think this is a great policy. I think we need to encourage the prescription of more antivirals. Hopefully this is something that stands up very quickly, because if you can keep people out of the hospital with a pill, that's really game changing when it comes to COVID-19. And the pills, they were in scarce supply earlier. They're getting in more supply, but they're underutilized because people don't know they're available. People don't know how to prescribe them, and people can't get them quick enough because by the time they maybe get through to their doctor, the doctor sends the prescription over to the drugstore, that 5-day period might have already elapsed.
No, I'm glad you said that, because obviously we want to help people get this information, since you said this information isn't widely known. Is the 5 days from the first symptom, or is it the 5 days from your first positive COVID test?
From the first symptom. So that's why we want people to rapidly test and rapidly get in touch with someone that can get them this pill.
So the minute you have a symptom, is this the home test that we all got in the mail from the government? If you get a symptom, you take that home test, you're positive, you should then get to your local drugstore, call your doctor, and try to get this pill?
Yes, I would definitely recommend that, especially if you're someone who has high-risk conditions for severe disease. So maybe you're older, maybe you have diabetes, asthma, whatever it may be. Obviously, if a 16-year-old tests positive, they probably are going to have a mild case to begin with, so they may not benefit that much. But clearly, in those high-risk individuals, the ones we worry about needing hospitalization, this drug can be very key.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Adalja. I went to an event recently, and it was an outdoor event. And they required that we take a PCR test and submit the negative results from that test. And then when we got to the event on site, they made us take another rapid test. So I'm wondering, based on everything you're saying, and we all thought that was overkill because we're all outdoors, is the PCR test going to become pretty obsolete since these home tests? Because that PCR test, I had to pay $195, first of all, to get the results back in an hour, because otherwise it was going to take 2 or 3 days, which tells me I was kind of ripped off, because obviously they could do it quickly and they just charged me almost $200 for it. But are these tests going to become pretty obsolete if we can all just do a rapid test at home?
They're still going to have a role, but when it comes to screening asymptomatic individuals, I think PCRs were never the proper test to use, but that didn't stop a lot of organizations from using them because it sort of made them feel better, but it really wasn't changing anything with the safety profile of an event, certainly not an outdoor event like you described. But PCR is going to have a role, especially in people who are sick in the hospital, where you need to figure out what they're sick with, and maybe the antigen test is negative because of the timing of when you did it or the sample that was done. But PCR tests are going to have a role, but mostly in a medical setting, not in this asymptomatic screening for events that people do.
So if people want you to have a PCR test, you should push back on that and say this antigen, rapid test is just as effective?
I do think that we have to get away from organizations using PCR tests to screen. It doesn't make sense scientifically. It's a waste of money, a waste of resources, and I think it's something that needs to go away. We have a better alternative. Rapid antigen tests are the appropriate tests for answering the question, am I contagious? If you're someone with no symptoms, you're not sick, you're trying to figure out if you're contagious, the antigen test is the test to use in that situation, not a PCR.
Thank you. And I felt like as I was paying my $195, I was being ripped off, but they required it for this event. But let's talk just briefly about these outdoor events. You don't really even need to do that rapid antigen test, do you, if you're going to an outdoor event?
Transmission in outdoor settings is extremely rare. It's not something that is very common. I mean, there are certain situations, maybe at a political rally where everybody is jammed together screaming, that may be higher risk. But in general, outdoor events have such good ventilation because there's natural ventilation that we don't see much transmission. So I don't think that testing is necessary for outdoor events.
And just finally, you would not say that people should be canceling indoor hotel events, venue events. We should just be moving full speed ahead with those events?
I do think that we can now get back to normalcy. We've got enough immunity in the population. We've got tools, we've got rapid tests, we've got so much knowledge about what activities are risky and which activities are not risky, that I think we have a sustainable approach to being able to navigate a world with COVID-19. But remember, there's always going to be a COVID-19 risk, and we're going to have cases that occur when people socially interact. But those cases are increasingly going to be much more manageable and not turn into a threat to our hospital system because of the immunity in the population, because of the tools we've developed.
And finally, doctor, should we be using the word endemic?
Yes, I do think we should be using the word endemic because this is a virus that's not going to be eradicated. It's not going to be eliminated. It can't magically go back into bats. We're going to be dealing with this for as long as there are humans on the planet. So this is going to be something that becomes one of our respiratory viruses that we deal with year in and year out. It's going to become the 5th seasonal coronavirus that we deal with. And I think that was always going to be the destiny for this virus. I think it just took some time for people to really come to terms with it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Adalja, for that great information, helping us understand this new phase of COVID that we're in. Lots to think about and lots for folks to consider as they move about the world, getting back to their normal routines. But again, always a pleasure to have you, and always great to hear, what the scientists are thinking. So we don't feel like this is just about the political winds changing, but this is really evidence and scientifically based. Again, thank you, Dr. Adalja.
Thank you.
My next guest is Dr. Monica Asnani. She is an LA-based pediatrician. So I wanted to bring Dr. Asnani back on the show because there are some different issues that relate to our children. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Asnani.
Hi, good morning.
So you heard what Dr. Adalja said. He's been with us through this whole journey of COVID. He's, well-respected, renowned, doctor, works at Johns Hopkins, has been on national television, has been on our show talking about this issue. How are things different, if at all, though, for children as we look at this new phase of COVID?
Yeah, so children, we have to remember that children are experiencing the same emotions as the adults are, and they're watching, and a lot of times the children are not fully informed. We sometimes ignore them and we don't tell them what exactly is happening. So we need to be very careful with our messaging to our children. We need to be very careful with the transitions. Like you said, it seems a little sudden that we're suddenly going to, no masks indoors, and you don't have to prove that you're vaccinated. And for a lot of children, that's very confusing, because for the past 2 years, we've just been drilling it in their heads. You have to wear masks. You have to be 6 feet apart from your friends, especially when you're eating. You have to use hand sanitizer. And now all of a sudden, if the masks go away, it's a little jarring for the children.
Yeah, and what are parents, your parents that are bringing their children into your office, what are they saying? Are they feeling like they're ready to take the mask off? Because we know a lot of school districts like New York and even California are moving towards no mask in school. Are parents feeling good about this?
Right. So it really depends on, number one, how old the child is. And as Dr. Adalja said, their family's risk tolerance. So as we know, children 5 years and up, they are eligible to be vaccinated. And like he said, if they are fully vaccinated and if they're eligible to be boosted, they're very well protected. And so those families can feel comfortable with their children taking off the masks, which is very helpful for especially sports and PE. And so those are for kids for 5 and older. Unfortunately, especially in the younger population, our vaccination rates are very low. Here in California, not even a quarter of the kids are fully vaccinated who are eligible. And we really need to do a much better job, because that will allow us to do these things like take off the mask safely.
Are kids who are under 5 eligible for vaccines at this point?
No, under 5 are not eligible at this time.
Okay, so only 5 and up. And you say in that 5 and up category in the state of California, only about 25% of kids have gotten the vaccination.
Yes, that's correct. We are trying.
Have you seen any trend or parents, moving away from it as all this news is happening that's suggesting that the pandemic is now endemic? Or parents saying, you know what, I didn't do it, forget it. It's no purpose of doing it now?
Right. There's not been a lot of movement. Initially in November, when the first children vaccine was released, there was a lot of excitement. That's now died down. Really the people are split into different categories. The ones who really wanted the vaccine, they got it right out of the gate. The ones who said, I think I'm going to wait. Now it's been, 3-4 months, they've already gotten it. And the ones who said, I don't need this, my child doesn't need it, they haven't gotten it, they probably won't.
And what about those kids who live in multi-generational households, which all kids do because they live with their parents who are obviously in a different generation. But if they live in a household with a grandmother or a relative that has diabetes or cancer or any other kind of, serious chronic illness, should those kids wear a mask?
So again, it depends on the family and their risk tolerance, but I can tell you, personally, my elderly parents live with us. And so my child is, a little bit more careful about masking and coming home from school and immediately taking a shower and changing all the clothes and, not trying to get too close to friends when it's in an indoor space, mainly because, he knows that he has his elderly grandparents in the house. But, some of his friends who they just have, young mom and dad, they're not as concerned.
Is there any recommendation you would give parents at this point? I mean, trying to make sense of all this rapidly changing news.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we really try to get the children who are eligible to be vaccinated. I always talk to people about hygiene. As soon as you come home from school, you go take a shower, you change all your clothes. All these little things are helpful. And again, about the grandparents and the immunocompromised, some of those people just already know, and they're just continuing their current protocol.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Asnani, for your insights. This news is happening quickly, and we're trying to keep up with it and trying to make sure parents feel like they have the best scientific evidence-based information so that they can make good decisions about their children and their families. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
All right, my next guest is Bree Dusseault. She is a principal at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and she's been quoted in an article that's talking about the loss that children are suffering as a result of COVID in schools, the emotional and psychological losses that our kids are experiencing. Good morning and welcome, Bree.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so Bree, this is, I mean, this is like head spinning news, right? All of these changes that are happening so quickly. And now Biden announcing that you can go to your pharmacist and take a test. And if you're positive, get a pill on the spot. And Dr. Adalja says if you get that pill within 5 days, it's going to be a game changer in terms of COVID. Governors across the country are telling kids you don't have to wear masks anymore. What are public schools doing in response to this rapidly changing news around COVID?
Well, you summed it up. It's been such a wild last couple of months, and we're seeing differences that have not been differences in behavior from the past 2 years. So we've been tracking how large and urban districts are responding to COVID and what that means for students and for families since March 2020, the first day that schools shut down. And we've seen this real shift in the last 2 months. For the last 3 school years now, districts have been trying to balance keeping students safe with helping them continue to learn and also be well. And that balance has been really tricky because what we know works for students in terms of their learning and their well-being doesn't always match up with what they need to stay safe. And so this last Omicron variant, the ways that district responded was different. And it's because we have more data. One, we know that students who were in remote learning in the last year did not learn as much as students who were in person. Two, we also know that students' well-being and mental health has really been impacted by distance and isolation. And third, we know from parents that they care more than ever that students get access to quality learning and a space where their students can thrive and be well. And they want to have a voice in that in a way that they may not have felt like they needed to before the pandemic. So I think all of those factors together, combined with what we heard from some of our medical experts here on the safety now in place, has meant that districts are fighting to keep schools open in person, whereas before they were shutting them down. There are still a lot of complications, and we are probably just now going to be able, I hope, to fully enter into recovery mode and really be focused on that learning side of the equation, because we hope that students can feel safe in their return to school.
Well, what about quarantining? Because we do know that kids who test positive are still being asked. I have a friend, as well as one of our producers, said they got a note from their kids' school about quarantining. One of my friends, her son had to sit out a whole week. So kids are still being asked to stay at home if they test positive, correct?
Yes. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because quarantining is another way for a student to experience a closure on their own individually. Even if the school doesn't close, the student can attend. And in a way, if the school is still operating and the student is not there, it's harder for them to have what we call continuity of instruction or just access to good learning. So this fall, double the students were affected by quarantines than were affected by school closures. So I think you're right on that students were more likely to be asked to leave school because of exposure, not even that they're necessarily sick, but just that they were exposed. And we saw districts setting quarantine policies based on CDC guidance, certainly for at least 10 days. In some cases, we saw some districts setting policies where some circumstances you could be out for more than 10 days, as many as 15 to 20. So those have been radically scaled back. But in the fall, what we found was that students were out for, if you were exposed to COVID just once, you could be out for 5 to 10 days. If you're exposed more than once, these days start to stack up. And we have a lot of students who may be qualified as chronically absent, which is a very serious category of absenteeism that usually prompts pretty serious actions outside the school to get those students back in. And we now have 3 times the students considered to be chronically absent just because of all of this quarantining and school closure this year.
So if we're still seeing the individual quarantining, you said the massive district closures, have pretty much gone away, why aren't more schools embracing continuing to keep kids in mask as a way to, mitigate or at least reduce the number of individual kids who have to sit at home for 10 days?
Well, masking is one strategy that many districts have done until very recently. And so in some cases they have to because their state has mandated it. In other cases, the board may have mandated it because of community and parent preference or staff preference. We have other communities, though, where masks are politicized and families are advocating not to have their children be masked. And there's no question we've seen the kind of schoolyard become a political grounds in a way that we maybe didn't expect from COVID. And so I think masking in a way is reflective of what a community wants, as well as what political battles a district leader is willing to kind of face. But I will say there are a lot of districts and schools where students are still masking or certainly have the option to mask. But we are, of course, seeing most districts taking away masking mandates. And districts have a number of different tools. They have masking, they have different types of testing. Some districts are doing surveillance testing where students get tested once a week. Some districts are doing test to stay, which is where even if you get exposed, you don't have to go into quarantine. And then, of course, some districts are trying to encourage vaccination of their students by having on-site clinics and things like that. So masks are one part of what makes the school safe, in addition to other components or strategies that districts have at their disposal now.
Yeah, it's really sad that the whole issue of masks has become so politicized, and it's not based on the science. It's based on, you see these red states, these blue states, and these fights, like you said, on the schoolyard about masking. But let's talk about some of this money, because Biden mentioned it last night in the State of the Union speech, the millions and millions of dollars that were directed to public schools in the American Recovery Act to address things like the COVID, from testing to equipment to facilities, and then programs designed to repair the deep social and emotional losses that kids have experienced. I've seen mixed stories about how this money is being used. Some stories say it's not making its way into the classrooms. I've seen others where school districts are using that money for bonuses for teachers, and they're luring, teachers from other districts. But from what you see, is the money making its way to help the kids try to, regain what they lost during these COVID years?
Another great question. We track this very closely, and there's actually a site that you can go to called the edurecoveryhub.org, where you can learn more about this. But essentially what we're seeing is that only about 5% of those funds have been spent so far. It actually may make sense because districts have received other tranches of funds that expire sooner, and so they're spending those funds down. So I actually think this is the moment for parents and staff and students to get involved in where those funds go. So districts will be spending down 95% of this $100+ billion American Recovery Plan funds over the next 2 years. The funds were designed to be very flexible. They're not highly restricted. And they also were designed to be to ideally shape themselves around the preferences of parents and students and staff, the community. That was written into some of the legislation. But what we're seeing on the ground is, one, not all districts have released their plans. So there's a transparency issue right now. We can find plans. It seems like about 60% of districts are being monitored right now. Some states are posting all of their plans online, and in other places, you can't find anything on the state or the district website. So that's one really important issue that needs to be resolved. You can't even know how to advocate if you don't know how the money is planned to be spent. Two, a lot of parents don't even know or feel like they've had a chance to give input into this. So it was actually required that districts get input, but we found that at least half of the districts that we review did not have a clearly obvious way that they got input into these plans. Now, they may be planning to get input over the course of spending down the funds, but they absolutely should be anchoring these decisions into what parents and students and staff want, and not just on kind of obscure or lack of transparent decision-making that happens behind closed doors. So those are two really important things right now. One survey from the National Parents Union that recently came out said that about 50% of parents were not clear on what the plans were about or where they were going, where the funding would go. So we're at a very important moment right now. We have 2 years to see these monies go into effect, to your point, and it's so important that they get spent in a way that tracks what is most needed. We may see districts spending these monies really differently. One district may choose to do a huge investment in extended learning or after school time. Another district may say, actually, we're going to invest in our teacher workforce and making the quality instruction there during the regular school day. So there's a lot of options, but it's just so important that we understand why those decisions are being made and that they anchor on the right data and the right decisions. What's
the website again where people can go to get this information?
Yeah, it's edurecoveryhub.org.
Can you spell that first word?
Yeah, edu, EDU.
Oh, edu. Okay, EDU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, recoveryhub.org.
Okay,
and what that site,
hub.org.
Yeah. And it actually lifts up examples of promising emerging practices that have been reviewed by national experts. And it also gives you a map of if you can go look at your state plan, and if your state has posted your district's plans, you can go find them. So you can start to look at what's happening.
Are you seeing what we saw with some of these dollars that came from the Recovery Act, or red states in particular that are like anti-Biden and anti, the Democratic Congress weren't even accessing the funds? Is that happening with respect to these funds that are designated for public schools?
So each state is in a different space of the money has been distributed to states. And so now states are in different places of distributing that money down to districts. And then districts distributing it to their schools. So there's not one universal pattern that we're seeing. We're seeing really different states being in different places. But you named something that's important, which is that it's so important that these monies not be politicized, that these are meant for children. They're meant for our teachers who are, have had the hardest last 2 years. So it's so important they get distributed in a way that districts can spend them down. We are really still in the planning phases. So we just want to see that these monies are distributed very soon and in a clear way if they haven't been yet. Also important to note is that most of the control is in the district's hands. Districts can control 90% of the funds. The state can control the other 10%. So this is something that at the end of the day has to be determined by districts. That's what's written into the law.
So when you get the money into the state, who's deciding which districts? Because we know historically poor districts that serve predominantly minority children, those districts are always shorthanded when it comes to funding. So how is this funding going to be distributed in a way that's equitable so that those poor and minority districts, get their share of the money?
Yes, that's so important. And there is a formula, and it basically tracks to channel the funds to districts and schools, or districts at least, that have a higher percent of schools of students in poverty, students in color, students with disabilities, English language learners. So that's been determined. Some districts actually won't get any funding, and other districts will get hundreds of millions of dollars. States actually need to post these allocations online. So again, you can go online if you want to go to your state website and actually find, and they will tell you district by district where, how those monies are being allocated, but they should be following federal funding preferences for vulnerable communities.
Just last question for you, Bree. This whole mask thing, are you finding teachers, those that are vulnerable, older, who may have chronic illnesses themselves, are they pushing back on this, the lifting of the mask mandate and saying they don't want to be in classrooms where, they're around high school students who are 17, 18 years old, or even, 5 and 6 year olds that are not vaccinated and masked? What are these teachers saying?
Absolutely. Teachers are saying that some teachers are saying that they do not feel comfortable and that they certainly will be wearing a mask themselves. And we see that in blue states or states with stronger union voices and representation, we tend to see more preference for those teachers' voices. And my guess is that across the country, there are profiles of teachers like this everywhere, probably in every school. And so it's really important that spaces be built for them to feel safe. One thing we didn't touch on, but maybe I can close with, is just that, we are moving into a reckoning with our staffing and labor in education. And this was something that was around before the pandemic. It's not new, but it's been exacerbated by the pandemic, like so many other inequities have been exacerbated. And so we are seeing so many systems desperate to find teachers to come work or to stay through this year. And so something like keeping a safe environment for teachers, especially veteran teachers who may have had great experiences and bring a lot to the table, is just an important strategy for districts in maintaining their workforce.
Are you seeing it? One way of doing that is by some hybrid learning model where some schools are going to keep online and combine it with in-person?
Yes, we would love to see options. We think that we do not want to return to the old normal. I think that's a worst case scenario because the system wasn't working for so many kids before. And parents understand they should have access to more options now. So we actually are looking for right now for what districts are planning to extend remote learning options. One great example is Indianapolis Public Schools, who launched 2 new remote schools in partnership with community-based organizations to serve students who didn't feel comfortable going back to school. And those will be permanent options moving forward.
Wow. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, there are obviously some schools, districts out there who are doing creative things to address the deficit and then moving forward. I'm glad there's this mechanism and that there's a watchdog group like yours, this money, I fear that so much of this money is not going to trickle down to those students that need it the most. And we're going to have a whole generation of kids who are just behind. I mean, academically, they're going to be going to college not prepared and, being socially promoted because schools don't like holding kids back. They don't like having, their numbers impacted by large numbers of kids who can't pass standardized testing. So it creates all of these really negative incentives for schools to do things that aren't always in the best interest of our kids. So continue to follow the money. And I think we all should be following the money. Biden announced last night this new prosecutor in the Department of Justice is going to be looking for fraud as it relates to money given during the pandemic relief period. So hopefully schools, to the extent that they don't do what they should do with the monies, won't be exempt from being examined and held accountable. But it's so interesting to see what's going to happen with the nation's public school districts. Thank you so much, Bree, for your input. All right, these vaccines, are they going away like the mask? Dr. John Moore is here. He's a vaccine expert and professor at Weill Cornell Medical College. He's been our resident vaccine expert. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Moore. I'm worried, Dr. Moore, don't hear a lot of talk about vaccines or pushing people to get their boosters. And as you know, even though we got a large number of people got their first and second vaccine, not everyone in the country did, and even fewer people got the booster. I think I read a number, we saw a number that was like 42% of Americans, so not even 50% got the booster. What's happening on the vaccine front?
Well, I think we have to wait and see what the future trajectory of the pandemic is. I mean, this, at the moment, as we've heard in the first half of your show today, we're in a pretty quiet phase now. I mean, the Omicron wave is more or less over. Infection rates nationally are down to, a level that we can tolerate, and hospitalizations are decreasing by the day. So perhaps that's where we will stay, but maybe not. It's very hard to project out the future. We may see another variant surge in the summer in the south, in when people congregate indoors. We may have another wave next winter when people in the north go back indoors. So we just don't know. Let's hope that we continue to see what we're presently seeing. But, in the long run, vaccination will remain important.
But why do you think we haven't seen, it seems like to me that nobody's talking about getting vaccinated anymore. We don't see the push on commercials. We don't see, folks talking about it in a way that, was just so publicly talked about just a month or 2 months ago.
Well, I think it depends where you live. I'm in New York City, and every day I see adverts pro-vaccination from the city health authorities immediately before news shows, etc. So there is still a campaign in our city pushing for vaccination. And you're right that booster dose 3 uptake was relatively low. 42%. Yeah, it's not great. Why was that? Well, some people had side effects from dose 2 and were put off and didn't want to go through a, feeling rough day, which, is understandable, but it's very short term, because if you get infected, you're going to feel a lot rougher than having a bad day from your vaccine shot. And that might change. There are additional vaccines that are likely to be authorized in the near future. One of them is a protein design from Novavax, and that is in clinical trials was very effective and had much less sore arm, headache type side effects. So that might be helpful. But we've also seen, disinformation campaigns.
Well, before we get to the disinformation, I want to ask you about that new vaccine. So if that vaccine is approved, will it be a 1 or 2 shot?
It's 2 shot. And in the short term, probably a third in the, after 6 months. But it's a more traditional design, and the side effects seem less. I had that vaccine in a clinical trial. I felt absolutely nothing, but that's just one person.
Do you expect, Dr. Moore, that we are going to start having to get a yearly, if not twice a year, COVID-19 vaccine?
Probably not twice a year. I think it's possible that we're going to need to have a regular boost, but again, it depends on the trajectory of the pandemic. If the virus doesn't resurge, if we finish up with a the current low infection rates, there won't be a great driver in a year's time or 6 months' time. But if the virus comes back and looks like it's breaking through, then we would consider surely another vaccine dose. And we hear talk of people wanting an Omicron specific booster. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen for two reasons. Firstly, we're not now seeing Omicron infections at anywhere near the same rate. And secondly, the studies that we've seen reported so far say that an Omicron booster is no better than a booster with the regular shot. And it is so much easier to give a third dose of the regular shot than roll out an entirely new shot. So I don't think we're going to see that happening. Maybe good to have that stock in reserve in case of worst case scenarios.
What about kids under 5? Still no vaccine for them. Is that pretty much off the table as well right now?
No, it's being developed. I mean, there were problems in the original clinical trial. The kids were underdosed. You have to adjust vaccine dose to body weight, and kids under 5 are pretty small humans, and you don't use an adult dose in a pretty small human. So you cut the dose down, but you have to guess how far to cut it. And it looks like Pfizer went on the low side, and they didn't get an immune response that was as good as they hoped. So now they have to test a higher dose. So, these things happen. I mean, it's not ideal, and hopefully the problems will be worked through in the next month or two, and we'll get a vaccine for the under 5s in the near future. The vaccines for the 5 to 11-year-olds looks like that too is a bit underdosed and might need tweaking upwards in additional studies or a third dose. Yeah. So these options are being looked at. It's better to underdose than overdose, right. But sometimes you just have to do a tweak.
And you did mention, and we're going to talk about this whole anti-vaxxer. I know you wrote a brilliant op-ed in the LA Times about how anti-vaxxers continue to spread so much misinformation about the vaccines. What prompted you to want to write about these anti-vaxxers?
Well, over the winter, we were seeing 2,500 people dying a day of COVID, and 90 to 95% of them were unvaccinated. Why are they unvaccinated? Because they've drunk the Kool-Aid and believe the anti-vaxxer propaganda that the vaccines are dangerous. So there are estimates that last year, 150,000 Americans died unnecessarily because they refused to take the vaccines. Well, that's a lot of dead bodies. That's not a good place to be. Yeah. So if we don't speak out against this, what are we going to see in the future? Well, we're going to see a reduction in childhood vaccination because, soccer moms in the suburbs have heard all this anti-vaccine propaganda, and the goal of the anti-vaccine movement is to eliminate childhood vaccination. So when this happens, when we see a real reduction in vaccine uptake for, whooping cough, diphtheria, measles, mumps, we're going to see a lot of dead kids, avoidably. So we have to counter this. And, there's a wider dimension to all of this. Children now have iPhones at very young ages. They have absolutely no way to discriminate between truth and fiction, between disinformation, lies, and facts, and no one's teaching them. And teenagers are particularly susceptible to believing anything they read on the phone. So we're going to see a generation of children grow up without the ability to know what is factually true and what is disinformation. And I think that's a really serious problem that we're going to have to take on because the projections are awful for what the next generation of children are going to believe and not believe.
Wow. And the projections say that these kids are going to be mini conspiracy theorists. They grow up into adult conspiracy theorists. Is that what the research tells us?
Well, there's an old saying from the Jesuits, give me the child and I will give you the man. If you subject a child to propaganda, there comes a point when it's too late to get them away from it. But it's an issue of teaching them. I mean, are all parents teaching their kids what is true and what is not true? When you Google geographical information, if you go to you're steered to a website that says the Earth is flat, I mean, that's not great. It's really going to be a problem. It's down to parents, it's down to schools, and it's down to all of us, because we can see this problem coming. It's getting worse, and if we don't do anything about it, we're going to be in a mess as a society.
Yeah, I was glad to see in your op-ed piece that you called out the fact that white supremacists have found a home in these anti-vaxxer movements, and that they are a big part of the group that's spearheading the misinformation, disinformation that we see on the internet. And then you called out the grifters, the fact that people are just making money on these bogus theories.
Those both are unfortunately true, and there's also emerging evidence that Russian disinformation bots are spreading and amplifying the material that is put out there. They don't necessarily generate it, but they're playing a role. So that becomes a national security issue. Yeah, there are anti-vaxxers that make serious amounts of money out of this because they turn people away from effective drugs and vaccines and say, look, buy my quack remedy #1 and my quack treatment #3, and make tons of money out of it. They're grifters. So yeah, that's part of the problem. And yes, there have been targeted disinformation campaigns against Orthodox Jews, against Somali immigrants, against Black people, against anyone that white supremacists and other socially disruptive sections of our society, they hate these minority groups, so they will target them because they want to kill them. It's really pretty vicious, and it can be very effective.
And it's so interesting when you see people like Robert Kennedy, a well-respected environmental lawyer from one of the most prominent political families in this country in our lifetime, become the ringleader of this anti-vaxxer movement. I mean, it didn't just start with COVID. It was, he was very active in the anti-vax movement related to autism too. What do you make of someone like that? Educated, been around, democratic politics his entire life, but yet he is leading this charge that Bill Gates and, has satellites that is, in your head, or just crazy stuff.
Yeah, it's part of the genre that if you believe one conspiracy, you tend to believe all of them. So, anti-vaxxers tend also to buy into the argument that 9/11 was an inside job and the Twin Towers were blown up by Mossad and the CIA. So it all goes together. It's a mindset. And yeah, what went on in Robert Kennedy's head? Who really knows? I mean, being the son of a famous father gives you a lot to live up to. There's a number of scientists who've gone off the rails, and they tend to be middle-aged. Their careers have passed them by. Their dreams of being world famous for their science is not going to happen. They go through a midlife crisis. Instead of, buying a leather jacket, getting a Harley, finding a young girlfriend, they embrace the dark side and betray their profession, and then become famous among the loonies, among those who worship the scientist who says that vaccines are dangerous. They become a cult figure, and that gives them the sort of mental lift they've been seeking to compensate for their professional failures. And we see the same in the legal profession in Stop the Steal.
Yeah.
Once respected lawyers become absolute quacks.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm not laughing. I'm laughing because it's so outrageous. It's pathetic and sad. I'm thinking of the top doctor in the state of Florida, that DeSantis, Harvard-trained lawyer, governor, has selected one of these anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, irreverent doctors to lead the scientific efforts, to lead the state of Florida. And some of the things this doctor, I guess he's their Surgeon General for the state of Florida, says is just absolutely outrageous. And coming from a Black man, many people latch on to that in the African American community and say, oh, if this Black doctor says it, it has to be true. And so much of what he says is absolutely positively nonsense.
Yeah, Lapada. Yeah, it's very dangerous. And of course, he's appointed because he supports DeSantis's policies. He's just doing what the boss is telling him. But yeah, his views are very, very dangerous. I mean, Florida is a train wreck now from the public health perspective. They even sanctioned one of the chief administrators of public health for promoting vaccination to his own staff. He sent around an email encouraging his own staff to get boosted and was disciplined by the governor's office. I mean, where are we when we tolerate this kind of thing? It's a really dangerous development in our society, and none of us has a simple answer. But if we don't talk about it and try and craft solutions, we're going to face a worse future.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Moore, for writing that op-ed. It was brilliantly written. Thank you for being a voice. Pushing back on this disinformation is so important. And I think about a friend whose daughter, again, well-educated, grew up in a very stable, normal household that believed in science. And she told me her daughter, from being home on the computer, working from home, has fallen into these different websites. And now she will not get vaccinated. She's an anti-vaxxer. She says some of the things she's repeating that she's getting from these websites is so just out there, so outrageous that it's caused her to become estranged from her family.
Yeah, that's unfortunately is happening all the time. And it's what's called confirmation bias. You go to websites that tell you what you want to believe. So you believe something, then you go to a website, you read other people believe the same thing, so it tells you you're right. And you get further and further down the rabbit hole and then get sucked in. I mean, 40 million Americans apparently literally believe that QAnon is true, that Washington elites are all engaged in child sex trafficking, the Pizzagate scenario, that Hillary Clinton had sex slaves in the basement of a pizza parlor.
That Obama was a child sex trafficker and abuser.
What can you say? I mean, you and I know that this is all complete nonsense, but 40 million Americans are prepared to believe this. And it tracks again with Republican voting. And it's no coincidence that death rates from COVID last year were far higher in Republican voting counties than Democrat voting counties, because that tracked with low vaccine uptake, which tracked with access to disinformation. You get your news from Fox News and Hannity and Tucker Carlson. You're not going to get vaccinated, and then you die.
Yeah, just finally, Dr. Moore, what are the three top topics that come up in these anti-vaxxer communities that people should be aware of? I'm thinking if we can tell them, if you hear these three things, turn your computer off, run, stay as far away from these people as possible. What are those three things?
Well, the worst thing that is thrown around is that 11,000 Americans died of COVID vaccination, which it didn't happen. The real number may be around 11, not 11,000. And that's based on twisting information on a CDC website that records deaths in people who have been vaccinated. So if you get vaccinated and walking down the street and get knocked over by a bus, you're listed on that site, but the vaccine didn't kill you. If you're a 50-year-old man and had a vaccine last week and then had a heart attack, which 50-year-old men sometimes do drop dead of heart attacks, that doesn't mean it's vaccine related. That just might mean you're an unfit couch potato who is susceptible to dropping dead of a heart attack. I mean, so that number is commonly centered around.
That's one. What's the second thing that they commonly talk about? Is it Bill Gates?
Well, that there's mind control, that Bill Gates microchips the vaccines. Well, yeah, sure. And if Bill Gates wants to track you, he'll do it via your iPhone and not via, a microchip in a vaccine, which doesn't simply exist. 5G networks intersect with vaccination. Vaccines turn your blood into sludge has been a recent one. I've seen that vaccination will turn you into a zombie because of misrepresentation of I am legend. It's just anything and everything you read, you go, how can people believe this? But they do.
Well, thank you. Again, if you hear any of those things, if someone says those things to you, if you read any of those things, know that they are absolutely positively false. And that's probably a website you don't ever, ever, ever want to visit again. So thank you, Dr. Moore. Always a pleasure to talk with you, helping us understand what's happening. I think your message is still get the vaccination, get the booster.
Sure.
Nothing's changed, right?
Nothing has
Get vaccinated, get boosted.
It'll stop you getting severely ill and dying. You might still get Omicron infected, but if you're vaccinated, it's going to be at worst a bad cold.
Yeah. All right. Got to leave it there. Thank you again, Dr. Moore.
You're welcome.
I want to thank all of my guests this morning. This news about COVID is coming out as fast, as furious, it's making our heads spin, and we wanted to make sure that you had the scientists talk. You had what the scientists, you were able to hear what the scientists had to say and not just rely on what your governor or what your state elected officials are saying. They're important when they talk about things that are political, but when it comes to your health and medicine and science, I say follow the scientists. I'm a lawyer, so I'm not going to try to build your house. If you have a legal case, you have a legal question, ask me. If you have a question about your roof or your plumbing, you need a construction guy. You need a plumber. You need a roofer. And the same thing comes with your health. It comes with vaccinations and wearing masks. These are things that impact your health. So you want to talk to a doctor, a scientist, someone who's reputable, someone who works in this area. Some doctors are out there, they're skin doctors talking about public health. Again, if you have a public health crisis, you probably want to talk to a public health doctor. So folks go to schools for years and years and years. They get practical experience, become experts in their fields. And so you want to rely on those experts and those quacks, as Dr. Moore call them, that are out there on a grift, that are making money on people's vulnerabilities. Stay as far away from those people as possible. Encourage your loved ones to stay as far away from those people as possible, because they are manipulating you, they're gaslighting you, and they're making money. And guess what? A lot of people are dead. 150,000 people, Dr. Moore said, died from COVID who were not vaccinated, who didn't have to die. Many of them bought into those conspiracy theories, and they are dead as a result. Our hearts go out to them, their families. Didn't have to happen, and we want to make sure it doesn't continue to happen. So, check the facts and check the science. Just some words to live by before I get out. A great statesman said just last night, "I know news about what is happening can seem alarming to all Americans. What I want you to know, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay." In case you missed the State of the Union, it was historic last night for lots of reasons, but the one that caught my attention was it was the first time that two women sat behind the president during a State of the Union address, and one was a Black woman. Bravo, Madam Vice President Kamala Harris, and bravo, Madam Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The speech has garnered over 78% approval by Americans who watched our Congress stand in solidarity for Ukraine. They watched and heard President Biden say those words about we're going to be okay. And he also said, bright, strong, resolved, we, the United States of America, stand with the Ukrainian people. I want to thank President Biden for those comforting words about this country, about the fact that even though we're divided, we're going to be all right, about the fact that even though COVID has killed over 900,000 people, that this is a country of 330 million people strong, and we're going to be all right, for encouraging us to stand with the Ukrainian people. I want to thank the president for his words last night. And if you didn't see the State of the Union, make sure you Google it. You can watch it on YouTube. You are going to feel a lot better watching the president reassure you that we are going to be all right. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Wear your mask, maybe, according to Dr. Adalja. But remember, we're all in this together.